So the short answer to whether or not I should get a real estate license, because I don't want all the liability and disclosure, is that it's not a big deal. What kind of, are you unethical? Are you planning on being unethical? What would you be afraid of disclosing? So in 23 years, I found it's not a big deal to have a license. So the interesting thing about being licensed is, the US is one of the only areas in the world that allow for limited agency, meaning I get a license to be your representative legally and sign for you and act on your behalf and speak for you with real estate. I mean, really around the world, the only job that's allowed to do that is a lawyer. Right? And so when I was in South America, I remember that there's no such thing as a real estate agent. When you go to buy or sell property, you're represented by a lawyer because an attorney is an agent, right? That's what they do, is they represent both parties. They're your agent or they're their agent. And so in the US, it's like we carve out this little thing called real estate agency. We let people take a class for 6 weeks. I mean, it's really amazing how reckless that is because, in less hours than it takes to get your a license to be a cosmetologist, you can legally represent someone in a real estate. I mean, it's a joke. And everyone talks about when they finished real estate school, they didn't understand anything. They just knew enough to pass the test. So a lot of times people say, well, do you want to get a license? Because once you're licensed, it's this higher bar. You always have to disclose that you're licensed. You have to let people know you're an agent. You don't want to create inadvertent agency. And so I hear people over the years who say, no, I've never needed a license. And you really don't need a license to be an investor. You don't need one. However, there are some tools that brokers have, that licensed people have, that I have found are worth it. MLS has always been worth having a license for, to have access to MLS. There's been times when I've written up agreements and kept the commissioner through my commission as a negotiating tool. And, disclosure, it's like, how fraudulent do you plan on being? I'm never worried about disclosing that I have a license. It's not like I'm going to be extra better at navigating the deal and beat people up. And so I got a license very early on in 2000. I've had one for 24 years. I've taken the broker's test in multiple states. I've found it's only been an asset and never really something that I've regretted or been a liability for. So I would say don't worry about it too much. You don't need it, but it's not going to hurt you to have it either. If you've heard that you can take a rental and put it on Airbnb or put it on VRBO, you are correct. It is legal, but there's some hoops you got to jump through. If you are interested in getting a lease on a house or an apartment and then furnishing it, and then you want to put it on Airbnb, use it as a short-term rental, maybe a VRBO, and rent it out and keep the difference, it's possible. You can do it. You have to make sure there's no local rules and regs that prohibit it. You have to make sure there's no HOA that doesn't allow for short-term rentals. But once you navigate that, and of course you want to make sure that whoever you're renting it from knows as well. It's called short-term rental arbitrage, where you're just putting yourself in the middle of the two parties and trying to pay low rent and bring in more short-term rental money, and that spread becomes money in your pocket. And it's a great strategy for people getting started, and one that's possible. And that was actually one of the most popular Manhattan strategies for Airbnb. So a few years ago, before Manhattan, New York City banned Airbnbs, short-term rentals, you had a bunch of people that would go rent out a house or rent out an apartment in Manhattan, where the price to buy it would have been $4 to $20 million. And some of them even had subsidized rents because it was a co-op, really low rents, and then they would turn around and put it on Airbnb, and all the tourists would come in. This was pre-COVID, and stay at those Airbnbs, and people were making a ton of money. So New York said, nope, no more, and they put in a restriction. And there are communities across the country that have short-term rental restrictions. So the first thing you as an investor need to do is figure out if you live in a community that has short-term rental restrictions. The second thing you have to figure out is if you find a house, if you find an apartment. So I have a condo in downtown Indianapolis. I've owned it since 2006. If I could put that on Airbnb, I'd make $15,000 to $20,000 a month. But the condo community, the HOA, has a ban against short-term rentals, and so I can't do that. I have a long-term tenant. I'm only getting like $1,800 a month for it. So that's the second thing. You have to make sure there's not a neighborhood restriction. The neighborhood I live in Idaho does not allow rentals of any kind. It's part of the HOA. So first you got to navigate the city and the state. Second, you got to navigate the neighborhood. The third thing you got to navigate is the landlord. Just because you see an apartment for rent for $1,000 and you're like, okay, there's no HOA, there's no rental restrictions, you can't just rent it out and then start putting it on an Airbnb, because I guarantee you that landlord has some clause in the lease that does not allow you to sublet. Okay, because that's what you're doing, is you're subletting. And so what you may consider is contacting that landlord, applying for the property, and let's say it is for $1,000 a month rent. What if you were to say to them, hey, Mr. Landlord, doing my homework, I think if I put this on Airbnb, I could get $3,000 or $4,000 a month. He may say, yeah, I've thought about that, but I don't want to furnish it. I don't want to mess with it. That's cool. What if I paid you $1,300 a month rent? What if I gave you a rent premium, more rent, in exchange for you allowing me to sublet this property? That could be a good motivator for them to allow you to sublet, to take that clause out of the lease, and then you're doing it right in front of their face. Because really what you're kind of doing is offering to share the profits with them from that. And I've had investors who've had a lot of success with that open disclosure arbitrage, because that's what you're creating, a deal where you pay here and you make there and you're sandwiched in the deal and you don't own the property. It's short-term rental arbitrage. It's a great way to get in with very little money, or it's a great way to take the place you live in right now and start putting it on Airbnb when you're out of town for the weekend. And so we like it, and we teach it, and it's a really good one.